All right, everybody. Welcome back to the Backwards Podcast. I'm your host, AJ Juliani, and I'm excited here today to talk with someone who I've been reading a lot of his stuff and just kind of getting into this idea of the future of education, the future of writing, especially in an artificial intelligence world. I'm talking about John Warner, who is here with us. He is an author, a consultant, a speaker. He has had many jobs at the higher ed and working with different companies. And most recently, he has been writing a lot about artificial intelligence. John, thanks for being here with us.
Oh, my pleasure. Absolutely.
So, I always ask our guests to start off, maybe folks don't know you. They want to hear a little bit about your story. I would say over the past couple of weeks, your Twitter account is probably, blown up, huh, John?
I lost a bunch of followers when Elon took over, and I've gained more back and then some. It's been sort of wild, actually.
I can imagine. So whether you're watching this or listening to this or kind of checking out the article, John, can you share just a little bit about your story, your background? You've had a multitude of jobs. I'm not expecting to get into all your different kind of roles, but a little bit about your career and how you got into what you're doing now.
Yeah, I mean, it's all very accidental. It's all very one foot in front of the other. My educational background is I have a graduate degree in creative writing. I went to get an MFA to become a novelist or a short story writer or something like that. And started teaching there, but was worried about having a sort of career in academia. So I went off and did corporate America work, got married. And my wife was and is a veterinarian, and she wanted to go back and get more schooling to become a specialist, which put us on college campuses for 4 years. And I started teaching again, and that's when I sort of caught the permanent bug for teaching, specifically teaching writing. And the challenge of it just became fascinating to me because I knew that the way I had been taught and the experiences students were not sort of serving the needs of themselves or the school or me or society all that well. So I became fascinated with working a sort of iterative problem each semester. Can I change my approach to teaching that gets students closer to being able to think and act as writers, as the kind of stuff I was doing in my own work? Along the way, I'd picked up some gigs of writing a blog at Inside Higher Ed. I was writing a column for the Chicago Tribune. I was still writing fiction. And my belief was these things all had more in common than they were different. And I could help students learn better how to build what I now call their writing practices, the skills, knowledge, attitudes, and habits of mind of writers. And then if I could design a curriculum around those things, they would just be able to solve any what I call a writing related problem. You got to write something, you need to be able to break it down and execute. And that's what I try to teach now. So that a series of non-tenure track jobs as I followed my wife's career around the country as a lecturer and instructor at Virginia Tech, University of Illinois, Virginia Tech, Clemson, and the College of Charleston. And all along I was writing and teaching and doing some other works. And then I stopped teaching full time, and I realized I had amassed a huge amount of material around this problem of teaching writing. That turned into 2 books. One is called Why They Can't Write, Killing the 5-Paragraph and Other Necessities, which is sort of my diagnosis of what's going on with the world. When I'm feeling grandiose, I call it my manifesto. And then the other one is called The Writer's Practice, Building Confidence in Your Nonfiction Writing. And that's just the collection of the curriculum that I developed over a 10, 12, even 15 years span of experimentation in the classroom. And since those books have come out, I've been kind of dedicated to spreading the gospel, working with schools, working with teachers, speaking to organizations about how I think this is a better way of approaching how we teach students to engage with writing. The key word being engagement. I think the thing that really most bothered me over the years with students is they came into college hating writing, seeing writing as something foreign from themselves, their humanity, anything with a communicative purpose. It was simply this sort of pro forma exercise you went through for the purposes of pleasing an assessment, not even a teacher sometimes, just like a rubric, a grid. And that's not how writing is. It's not how it is for me. It's not how anybody who likes to write or is good at writing. So I wanted to kind of reclaim their spirits, if nothing else. And so then we find ourselves today where ChatGPT shows up into the world.
Yes.
And all of a sudden, everybody is freaking out that the stuff they're asking students to write in a high school literature course or a first year college writing course can now be done by an algorithm within a matter of seconds.
Yes, that is where we are right now. And, I love that story and just how you've kind of gone into each role. I taught middle school language arts, high school English for a long time. I once was a student who didn't really like writing. And I think I carried that into my teaching as well. When you kind of talk about that book, Why They Can't Write, and your subtitle is right, Killing the 5-Paragraph Essay. Why is that so important? Like, what did you see that really, because that is a mainstay, right? Why is that such a bone of contention?
Yeah. So when I say that I want to kill the 5-paragraph essay, sometimes teachers will literally blanch. They'll be like, how do we why do you want to kill this thing that I think I need? And one thing I try to make clear is the 5-paragraph essay, it's more a symptom, it's more of an avatar of the issue than it is the problem itself. The problem itself, for me, is the process that leads to the creation of the 5-paragraph essay, which is highly rules-based, highly prescriptive, divorced from a genuine rhetorical situation that has an audience, that has a purpose, that has a message. And what it does is induce students to create what I call writing-related simulations, as opposed to a genuine process of writing. One of my mantras about writing is that writing is thinking. And as thinking, it is both the expression of an idea, that is, I need to put this idea on the page because I'm communicating it to an audience, but it is also the exploration of an idea. The act of writing itself allows the writer to explore the idea that the notion that they've started with. And one of the things I discovered in working with first-year college students is, in a school context, almost none of them had the phenomenon, the sensation of writing something and discovering something new about themselves, about what they believe, making an intuitive leap or connection in their own subject while writing in school. And that is a sort of fundamental disengagement from authentic writing or meaningful writing. And so I want students to have a different set of experiences than a sort of rules prescriptive based approach that is designed not around communication, designed not around developing as a writer, but is designed around a very narrow band of assessment. A big part of the book also is, why did we wind up in that state where that's what sort of dominates in writing instruction? And that's where I get into a lot of the systemic issues around this. I'm as a former college instructor and sometime part-time college instructor still, I'm very sympathetic to the challenges teachers face in the classrooms around writing. They're under-resourced. The incentives for producing these sorts of simulations are, in some cases, extreme. When I publish the book, I've heard from teachers who will be like, I'm smuggling 10 minutes of this into my class every day because a principal or a department chair wants them passing assessments. Teachers have too many students. They don't have enough time. One of the things we know about teaching writing is it requires some measure of one-on-one interaction with students, which becomes impossible when you have too many students. So the book is really about, hey, here's all of the underlying conditions. Here's all of the barriers between creating an atmosphere in which students and teachers can effectively collaborate on better learning to write. It's a heavy lift. I won't lie. I wish it was a matter of sort of spreading the gospel on a different pedagogical approach.
Right.
It's not that. It's not only that. It's part of it, but it's certainly not only that.
And it's interesting that, and me and you were talking some about these systemic issues. All of a sudden, ChatGPT comes along, and a lot of schools, a lot of places that teach writing, have students write, or really any type of write, could be work writing as well. They haven't dealt with these systemic issues. So now a tool comes along that if you have no reason for writing other than to produce something to get a grade or an outcome, this tool lets you do it in a matter of seconds. What for those folks that don't know, what is ChatGPT? You've been following along for a while here.
Yeah, so ChatGPT, it's important to know what it looks like it can do versus what it's actually doing. It looks like it can write. It looks like you can put in a prompt and it will produce a string of perfectly fluent English syntax. You can even tweak it by saying, do it in the style of a particular writer, and it will tweak its approach to mimic that writer to a certain degree. It pretty much depends on who you put in terms of how much that changes. But all it is a pattern matching algorithm that's been trained on, the volume of English syntax it's been trained on we almost can't conceive of it. The amount of pattern matching it has been conditioned to. But it is not evaluating content. It is not combining content. It has nothing to do with content. It cannot think. It's merely, when this string of characters that somebody put into me comes, what are strings of characters that exist in the world that I can put in front of the person who responded to it? And I think it's important to realize that this is how it works. It's not intelligence in any way that we would consider it. It's not general intelligence. It's a sort of mimicry. It creates literally a writing related simulation of the sorts of things that I think students have been incentivized to create for the purposes of school and assessment. But it's very convincing. I mean, it's
right.
It's great at BS. I was that kind of student too, where it's like, I will absolutely just go through the motions for you just long enough to get my B. And that's kind of what ChatGPT will put out for you. Now, if you actually know, if you know what it's talking about, you'll realize, oh, that's kind of wrong fairly often. But if you don't, particularly something like this thing would crush the AP exams in seconds, like just absolutely slaughter any prompt the College Board has ever put into the world within seconds.
Yeah.
And each version it would do, you could have it do an infinite number of responses to the same prompt, and no two would be alike. Right? So they would never be two copies of each other. If this is not sort of an indictment of the stuff we value in those contexts, I don't know what is. Why ask students to write something that an algorithm can do that cannot think, cannot connect ideas, has no intuitive leaps, is not creative, independent of some clever person messing around with it by tweaking the prompt. Any creative element ChatGPT can do is because the person manipulating the algorithm is putting in the creativity. As an experiment, I tried to get it to rewrite the lyrics to Steve Miller Band's The Joker.
Yes.
I gave it a prompt, like, write a song about a guy. Sometimes he's called Maurice, sometimes he's called the Space Cowboy, but really he's known as the Joker, who's a smoker and midnight toker. And I'm like, write that song, and it can't even. It's nonsense.
Right.
So it can't think. It doesn't reason. It really puts a very convincing simulation of thinking in front of people, and I think that's important for people to recognize. It is not a replacement for human cognition or human intervention into these things. It's a syntax generator, an excellent one that is even having looked at this stuff over the last couple of years and experimenting with previous versions, ChatGPT is such a quantum leap
Right.
ahead that's why it's blowing minds. If you saw this 18 months ago, you'd be like, clever. What a fun little digital toy. And now it's kind of like, oh wow, this is something.
Yeah, and I think that's such a big thing to bring up here. This is an open free tool on open AI. Anybody can sign up, anybody can use it with a Google email address or whatever you need. And it works to answer, like you said, AP exam level questions, which when you think about K through 12, that's kind of like the highest reach of writing that kids are doing. And you just said it would crush it, right? It would crush it. Now, the thing that's important to me as well is what you just brought up is we're not sure what this is going to look like in 12 months, 18 months down the road. We know it's going to keep on improving. You said something in your article that I wanted to bring up. You wrote an article for Inside Higher Ed that was kind of titled "Freaking Out About ChatGPT," which I thought was a great just frame. And you asked the question, so what are we supposed to do about this? And you say, I think we should collectively see this technology as an opportunity to re-examine our practices and make sure how and what we teach is in line with our purported pedagogical values. And I guess the question to me is re-examining enough? What would be that next step?
Yeah, so that's the start, right? And for me, that question of values is the core of any pedagogical approach, right? I mean, you're a PBL guy, you're a project-based learning guy, right? Like, there's all kinds of arguments we can make about, oh, it's aligned with these outcomes and these sort of stuff. But at its core, if you embrace something like PBL, what you are articulating is an underlying set of values about the kind of work that is worth spending time on,
right,
when you're in school. So I think the first question is, what is the kind of work that's worth spending time on in school in relation to writing? One of the lines my own lines I quote from Why They Can't Write is, life is to be lived, including the ages from 5 to 18. And school is the dominant experience of American youth. It's the thing they spend most time in. Many of them spend more time in school than they do sleeping, unfortunately, sometimes because of school.
Yes.
It's the sort of dominant stressor in their lives. It's something that so many students feel is the determiner of their life. The notion of school is sort of an endless series of hoops to jump through and to get to the next thing, as opposed to being in the moment of the experience that you're doing and learning in, is pervasive. And I think, if as a PBL guy, I think you would agree with me. I think that attitude is damaging. So if we start with that value, that the work we're asking students to do should be worth doing for students, we can then begin to say, well, what does that look like? I think the biggest issue, it's an issue that PBL is absolutely designed for, and my philosophy is aligned with, is engagement. We are in an engagement crisis in school. The Gallup has some very robust data that predates the pandemic. I would be fascinated to see what, showing that something like a third of all students are actively disengaged, and more than 50% are at least not engaged, right? So fewer than 50% of students, if you ask, are you engaged with school? They're like, nah, or absolutely not. And that percentage of engagement drops every grade from like third grade through junior year of high school. It ticks up slightly senior year, when they're like, oh, there's light at the end of the tunnel, or I've got to get my act together.
Yes.
Because I'm leaving school.
I saw that chart. I've seen that and shared that out, right? It's just a little tick up.
Tiny. So it bottoms out junior year, and then people are like, holy crap. if we can start with that, because there's nothing that is inherently miserable or painful about writing. Now, it's not to say writing isn't difficult or frustrating,
Right.
but there's nothing that says the experience itself has to be a straight misery. So when we start with that value, we can then move forward. Okay, what is the kind of activity we want students to do? What do they learn and experience when they do this activity? And then sort of the most important part, I think, relating to ChatGPT, because I think I say this in that same article, or I said it in the subsequent one I wrote in my newsletter. You can't out-prompt the thing. You
Right.
can't just say, I'm going to try to make a prompt that ChatGPT can answer, because even if it can't do it now, as you were saying, in 12 months, we don't know where this thing is.
Yeah.
It cannot yet. They do, well, it can. They've not released a version that can crawl the web and find information in real time, because that's when it really starts to
I
make
just
stuff up.
just saw a paid version called Chat Sonic. And I guess they're combining that open, resource. And like you can ask, are the Philadelphia Eagles going to win the Super Bowl this year?
Yeah.
And pull some real-time stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, it'll try. I mean, that's where it really starts to make stuff up, and it's the parameters they put around the current ChatGPT make it more reliable than the previous versions. And when you introduce real-time crawling of information, it doesn't know disinformation, it doesn't know made up
Right.
crap. It just says, hey, this is about this, I'm bringing it in. So a big part of this also is assessment. That is, what do we value in student writing? And it cannot only be the end artifact. It cannot only be the thing they turn in at the end of a process. It has to be the entire process. So one of my messages on Twitter when people were freaking out about it, I was like, this technology does not threaten my pedagogy at all. Because I don't just grade something students turn in at the end. I am a presence in the entire arc of experience as they go through one of my assignments, what I call writing experiences in the book. And so being present means that I am also assessing that arc or that growth or that journey. And then I introduce, some metacognitive reflection elements that require them to also understand and articulate their own learning. And ChatGPT can actually fake that, but not in a way that's convincingly human. It's the kind of thing where if a student turned in a reflection that ChatGPT would go, I would say, okay, no credit for this one. Go back to the well and tell me something that
Right.
learned, or if you didn't learn, what do you think's going on with your not learning in this situation? So it really is this, we have to look at the whole experience. And going back to stuff we talked about earlier, that requires a system that allows teachers the time to do that work.
Yeah.
Because if teachers cannot monitor the arc of that experience, if they cannot engage over that entire journey, it becomes very tough to do that kind of assessment.
Yeah, I find a lot of connection between how you're talking about writing and assessment. It's a lot of the ways that I talk about project-based learning or design thinking. And I feel like there's always three main areas why people say we can't make that change. Like number one would just be time. We don't have the time to build out the curriculum to teach that way. Number two is always been, well, the assessments, right? Like, the assessments, got to get kids ready for this type of assessment. And number three, which I always found was a pretty fascinating one, and I didn't realize this until I started really working with a lot of schools and not just my own, is the perception of parents and the students. Because there's a Harvard study that came out a couple of years ago, and it basically said the students that they did this study on thought that they were learning more in a lecture-based traditional setting, but they actually learned a whole lot more in active learning. But there was an anti-correlation there between their perception and what their actual results were. And I kind of see that this way as well, in terms of kind of what you're talking about. How do you see us kind of combating and overcoming some of those issues?
Oh man, I mean, that is a heavy problem, and it's persistent and it's pervasive. And it's really sort of it's for me around writing, it's a hearts and minds campaign. um, uh, one of the things I'm alert to on Twitter is when I come across a tweet from a parent talking about how much their kid hates writing
Mhm.
for school, and I jump on it and say, not to impose myself on the conversation, but it doesn't need to be this way.
Right.
There's other ways we can think about this where your child doesn't have to be miserable. I do think there's a lot of parental anxiety around these things. I think there's a lot of just disconnects between the K-12 space and the college space, and frankly, I put a lot of the blame on colleges. I think colleges have not done a great job of actually communicating down to the K-12 level, like, actually, we want students doing this. Because when students would come into my first year writing course, and I would ask them, okay, what were you told makes a good essay in high school? I'm like, 5 paragraphs, never use I, no contractions. Every paragraph has to have 5 sentences. And then some other student chimes in like, no, 7 sentences.
Right.
And somebody else says 9. Like, wow, 9, that's a pretty long paragraph. And they start telling me all the rules. And then this was years ago. I had one of the most diligent students I've ever had. She had her high school English notebook, and she opened it up to the pages where she'd written down every acceptable word or phrase that her teacher said was an allowable transition between paragraphs, because the obsession was structured paragraphs with transitions in between paragraphs, and she got points off if she didn't have one of those. She'd written them all down. And then I put up my, sort of like side by side on a PowerPoint slide. I'm like, okay, here's what we're doing here. Everything's a custom job. You've got a specific audience.
Yep.
You're solving a writing related problem in a defined rhetorical situation, which you're going to have to analyze before you start writing. And they feel some measure of despair, some measure of betrayal. Why have we been doing this? And they will flat out say, like, I was told that we were doing this in high school because we needed to do it for college.
Mhm.
And that really is heartbreaking, because not only the students aren't enjoying it, I think a lot of the faculty who are teachers who are required to teach writing don't enjoy this process. It's sort of a collective immiseration around these things. And so, I attack the assessments and the structures that incentivize these things a lot, but ultimately my feeling, and maybe, I'd be curious to hear from you about your experience with project-based learning. My feeling is ultimately it has to be a kind of grassroots uprising.
Mhm.
That just simply says, we're done, we're rejecting this, we're doing something different. This is easier in some school contexts
Yeah.
than others.
It has to be people collectively saying we're going to do something different. And they have to work with a lot of stakeholders to do that, right? I think that's kind of the big key here. You have to bring the parents in and talk about why you're doing it differently. I would always bring in, when I was a director of learning, you try to bring in college professors to talk to your high school teachers. I feel like that's always a good connection, but the college admissions process is what really messes up most of this. I mean, it really, what they accept, what they want, all of the prompts that they're giving, the prompts on the SAT, they're all this type of writing that ChatGPT could crush.
Mhm.
And I think that we're talking about. I do draw some correlation between what math teachers had to go through a couple of years ago with photo math. I remember showing math teachers that I was working with photo math for the first time. Kid hovering their phone over any math problem and giving every single step and the correct example and answer. And sometimes it gave you multiple different steps if you want to answer in different ways. And I remember them saying, we can't give 50 questions, check your answers in the back of the book for homework anymore. Like we can't do that anymore. And so, math teachers I was working with in a district, they switched to, hey, we're going to have you record a video much like a Khan Academy, where you're talking, walking us through the steps of why you're doing different steps, how you're getting to that answer, explaining the answer. And we're just going to have you do 2 or 3 problems and turn that in. That's the type of thing, like you said, they're with the process. They see the process. They're part of the learning process. They're a guide for that. They're facilitating, but it also takes a whole lot more work to go through all those videos and assess it that way, rather than just kind of checking off that your homework is done. And so for me, it's like, what are some of the things we can eliminate? Like, technology doesn't always redefine. Sometimes it just eliminates. What are some of those things that we can eliminate as kind of ChatGPT and these types of tools come around? You told me that you're working with some different schools, one outside of Chicago. How are teachers responding when you're talking about ChatGPT and just artificial intelligence in general?
There, a lot of it is there's a generational thing going on, right? Like, I'm 52. I came up before this stuff existed. The first writing course I taught as a teaching assistant in 1994, we were still using the card catalog and the Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature in the library. There's a kind of a crude internal digital database for the library, but like the widespread commercial internet search, well, none of that existed yet. And so now here we are today with this kind of stuff. So the teachers being so much younger than me, they are they're interested in ways of, how do we incorporate this? How do we think about this as something that exists in the world, potentially as a tool, certainly is something that they know students are going to be aware of and be able to utilize in the way you talk about photo math, right? Like, I remember seeing somebody demonstrate that to me, and thinking like, well, if this ever comes for writing,
Right.
we've got some splaining to do. What I hope it gets rid of is these pro forma performances of writing, like the college essay. Which, again, the ChatGPT murders it. Just absolutely. I have a niece who's a senior in high school, applying for colleges, and I sort of helped her with her essay, and I made a promise. I'm like, well, I could give you a very shortcut to doing an essay that's going to be
Right.
perfectly functional for what you're applying for. But given who I am and my background, I'm going to put you through the paces until you come up with something that's actually, developed through an authentic process and interesting. But it doesn't end up in all that different a place. It's more interesting. It's more lively. It's got more of her voice in it. It sounds more like her. And I think that's all a good thing. But none of that matters on the other end of the admission equation. All that is immaterial. I hope it kills that thing. I hope it kills it dead. I hope no student ever writes an admission essay ever again, because it's a total waste of time. Students learn nothing. Colleges learn nothing of interest. It's a pro forma exercise, and I don't even know. I haven't been on the other side of the equation. The thing never made sense to me when I applied to college. It makes even less sense to me.
Yeah.
Less sense to me now. We should be examining those things, right? And really, I mean, the other things I think parents have to wrap their minds around college is I may get the stat wrong. You can correct it later, but it's something like 80% of colleges admit 50% or more of the people who apply. They're essentially not selective. The vast majority of students are not going to apply to what my friend Akil Bello, who's an expert in college admissions and advocate for test-free admissions, calls highly rejective colleges. These colleges that we think of as dominating the space and dominating our minds around this are incredibly rare.
Yeah.
The vast majority of students are going to go to a college that they are likely going to get into if they apply. And so all of the angst and heartbreak we put into these things doesn't need to be present.
Yeah,
If I'm a college and I want to see how students write, I'm figuring out how do I get a hold of an authentic student portfolio of writing they
for
produce
sure. Yes.
over time, and maybe even I can look at how they progressed rather than where
Mhm.
they are now. That's the student I'm interested in
Yes.
if I'm a college. So some of it is we have to, us regular folk who, go to a state college or university and are not applying to the places that accept 5% or 10% or 15% of the applicants, um, have to realize we're kind of living in a different world
Mm.
than those places and reject it.
Yeah.
Don't play by the rules of a game that you're actually not part of and doesn't
Yeah.
serve you.
Doesn't. It definitely doesn't serve you. I think that when I hear you talk about some of those things get eliminated, it's like, yeah, why would that, college admittance essay exist anymore with tools like this? And there's a lot of things like that. I do wonder though, and I hate to be like dystopian, but I do wonder what happens, you think, in the next decade here if the system doesn't change in education? How are things upended? Because I've seen a lot of individual places change. I've worked with a lot of great schools that have changed practices, that have worked with their community, and they aren't going to be impacted by this as much as the majority of places. But I sometimes feel like I don't see that many places changing anything. I just don't. What do you think is going to happen there?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough to think about. Not that I can't think about it because I think about it all the time. Like it's painful to think about if we don't change, because my concern is, given the power of this technology, given the incentives around its use, given there's certainly already companies that exist that will both sell you the algorithm and the policing for student use,
Mm-hmm.
or who are creating entirely canned AI curriculum that is
Yep.
both assigned and assessed by the AI, and it will be cheap, it'll be efficient. You will have a simulation of students being ranked by ability that people seem to love in the current system. It will be able to rank and sort in a superior fashion to the way humans do it.
Yeah.
And so if those are the values that the system continues to embrace, there is no bottom. And a sort of personal education done with humans at a human level, where we remember that life is to be lived, including the ages of 5 to 18, may
Yes.
become, a luxury item for those who can afford it, for those who can opt out of public schools and into private education. I mean, there's all kinds of other forces that are coming for public schools at the same time.
For sure. Yeah.
So this is just another challenge. It is for me, it's a matter of the collective public standing up and saying we believe students and schools should be a certain way, should have a certain underlying system of values around humanity, for lack of a better
Right.
word.
Right.
And there's no guarantee of that. We've already been sliding away from that without this tech for
Mhm.
a couple of decades at least. So now that this is there and that can just plug it and substitute, we could have some kind of Wall-E style dystopia
Yeah.
where students interact with these things in order to move up a level, and then you go into your kind of drone job. I mean, it's sort of horrible to contemplate. I don't like to really think about that, other than it does seem possible to me. I
Yeah.
wouldn't put it past us. There's an element of just say no to it. Like just
Right.
don't do that thing that could really have bad consequences down the line.
Yeah. No, I just see a lot of these forces converging at the same time, staffing shortages, states that don't have the funding to fund retirement plans anymore, unions getting bust, you just see all these things convulsing, and then people looking for cheap solutions. And it's like, on a silver platter, here's your cheap solution. I think just 3 years down the road, anybody that's doing distance online virtual learning, you're going to have deep fakes combined with like the ChatGPTs of the world that could have my face talking, presenting, doing right. And it's not that far off, right? It all exists right now. It's just no one's put it together yet to have what ChatGPT is spitting out be in my face, right? Like that's it.
No, it's certainly all that stuff it's not just theoretically possible. It's on a relatively near time horizon, and the students will be answering fake GPTU with fake GPT them, and at some point it becomes, a sort of race to the bottom of credentialing, of sort of the minimum effort to get sort of a stamp of a credential, and the credential becomes increasingly meaningless. I don't, all those threats to schools that you name are absolutely true. If we can't excite people about being teachers, how do we get teachers? If we have states that refuse to fund public education, how do we have decent public schools? If we have people who want to create a system where all the educational dollars will follow the student because they see a business opportunity to, create a kind of, the marketplace for education is massive. When it looked at in aggregate, and there's people who are like, let's get some of that.
For sure. Yeah.
And we have to choose differently, and the thing that I would say, if there's parents listening, and the thing I would say to them is like, what's going to make your child not succeed in like, oh, they're going to get a good grade or they're going to go to college and kind of stuff, like what's going to make your child happy? What is going to give them an interesting and fulfilling life? One of the greatest things I can say about my own life, having done all these different things and sort of every 2 or 3 years, even like jumping to like a new adventure, is I generally wake up in the morning looking forward to what I have to do.
Yep.
In the last week or so, and since ChatGPT came into the world, I'm having conversations with multiple people every day about this technology in schools and what it means. And that's fun for me. And that never would have happened if I hadn't been given a sort of base of curiosity, a base of thinking about the world, and even a sufficient measure of, I won't make myself look special, but a certain measure of sort of courage, a certain measure of belief that expressing your own agency in the world is worth doing, right? That having an impact on others is something worth spending your time, as opposed to just kind of going through the motions that'll get you a paycheck and that kind of thing. I'm a very happy, contented, reasonably economically secure person. Like, nobody should want for more than I have. And I can thank my grade school teachers who I dedicated Why They Can't Write to, because that's where I learned the stuff that really I rely on today. I didn't know it at the time, but now I'm grateful. And I worry that not enough students are having those kinds of experiences that I was allowed to have because I came of age before all this stuff got into the system.
No, I think anybody that's been following me for a long time knows that I consistently say, how do we expect kids to turn into adults that can navigate choice and decisions, have ownership and agency, if we don't allow them to navigate choices and decisions, have some ownership and agency while they're in school from 5 to 18? It doesn't make any sense, right? Like, there's no way you can prepare humans to do that by just telling them what to do and then have them do it. It just doesn't work that way.
No, it doesn't, and we know that, right? Like
Right.
if you have a conversation one-on-one with a teacher or a principal or a parent, they're like, oh yeah, I get that. But really, if they don't get A's,
Yeah.
their future is over.
It's limited.
Um,
Right. Yes.
and unfortunately, we've constructed a world where that's more true than it used to be. I mean, that's always been a bit of a scare tactic around getting students to comply and behave. It was very untrue when I was going through high school. It's somewhat more true now because we've narrowed the funnel of success, right? Like the opportunities are the cost of entry is higher, around college costs and having to take out loans and this kind of stuff. It's like the margin for error is smaller. But again, these are things we can reject. These are things we can decide we don't want to make it impossible to go to college without taking out loans or going into debt. We
Yeah.
can create curriculum and school experiences that allow students to practice making the choices they're going to have to make eventually, if not in college, certainly in life. They're really, predominantly teaching freshmen over the last 10, 12 years of my career, that inability to make choices is sort of the biggest struggle students have in college, and not just around school, but around anything.
Yeah.
That that agency element is sort of missing, and it's sometimes a factor in sort of a failure to connect and thrive at college. They just can't figure out how to get up in the morning.
Right.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
uh, I'll ask in a first year writing course, like, how many of you, I'll try not to ask too leading question, but like, how do you get up in the morning? Like,
Right. Yeah.
I'll say like, I'm an old guy, so I get up with the sun. So
Yeah. Yeah.
when the sun
Right.
rises, I wake up. I'm
I'm
like,
up.
oh,
Yeah.
I have 3 alarms, or I do this. Like 50, 60% of students are like, my mom calls me.
Wow. Wow.
And that's, you know, and I said, well, how do you feel about like, I know it's bad, but it gets me out of bed. Okay, well,
Wow.
you gotta do what you gotta do, but someday mom's
Not gonna call.
not gonna call. She'll be busy, or her phone will be out of juice or whatever. Like,
Yeah. Right.
what are you gonna do?
Got
Um,
it.
so we should be building those behaviors, those skills, and really I think of it as a form of freedom, right? Agency
Yeah.
to me is about freedom. Like, you have
For
the
sure.
freedom of your own mind, you have the freedom to make a decision, you know how to work in the world in an efficacious way. That's a real gift to students,
Yeah.
and the sooner the better.
It is. It is. And I don't want to end on a negative note. I feel like our last question for you should be more of a positive. On the flip side, what do you see as that utopia? If this is
Well,
a
yeah.
wake up call, what do you see as that utopia? How would things change?
So one of the things I've experienced working with students, changing my writing curriculum, and again, it was iterative over the years. It wasn't like all of a sudden the light bulb went off and I was like, I'm doing things totally differently now.
Right.
It was a process. But once I kind of got to a relative endpoint where, I would never say it's there. I constantly tweak, I constantly change. There's
Mhm.
always something you're learning working with students. But let's say I got 95% of the way there, I realized students were engaged, students were learning, students were actually sometimes enjoying
Mm.
writing. There were occasions where I would say, this thing should be about 750 words, and somebody's turning in 3,000 words. And like, what happened?
Right.
I'd be like, I can't read all this. What are you doing to me? But it's like, oh, I just got on a roll and I started thinking about stuff, and they just went. And that's a win. That's how I write. That's how I think. That's how I do my work, where I'm writing and publishing multiple things a week. And they're turned on. They're switched into the on position intellectually, creatively. And my belief is that then can carry over to other subjects. If they can switch them on in their history class, they start to think like a historian. If they can switch themselves on in biology, they think like a biologist. So there really is a brighter way of doing it. It's nothing we don't have to figure anything out.
Mm.
There's nothing we don't know.
Like
It
that.
really is a matter of just doing it. So we don't have to like do a bunch of studies. We don't have to kind of like try this and try that. We can try a million things. There's not only one way to do this. Some of the work I do is helping teachers work through their own set of values to come up with their own approach to curriculum,
Yeah.
right? They don't have to adopt mine. But if we can, once we do that, it's there and students are ready and they're eager for it. And it becomes very exciting and energizing to see students turned on, switched into the on position around this stuff. And it happens, if not within 3, 4 weeks, 5 weeks in a course I teach, at least within the span of a semester. They kind of, at the end of the semester, as students, what do you know now that you didn't know before? And it can be anything. It's like they could be trivial factoids that they picked up in their writing, but a lot of it's like, I didn't know that I could teach myself. And that's the whole ball of wax right there. If you walk out of a class or a degree program or something and say, I can teach myself, you are ahead of a lot of people, and you're going to go succeed in your profession. You're going to be happy. You're going to figure out what you want to do with your life. It's a big deal. And it's achievable. We've been doing it for, some people have been able to do it and had the experience that allowed them to do that for centuries. Other students, we've closed off that opportunity. We don't have to do that anymore.
Yeah. No, I mean, to me, that idea of teaching yourself to learn, or just teaching yourself anything and being self-sufficient in that manner, and having the self-management and, just the self-control, all those pieces that come with being a contributing human to society, to your family, to the work, to the world, that type of thing is powerful. And, I hope that folks that are listening to this conversation see that what you said in that last segment there was so powerful. We don't have to find anything new here. We just have to do what we know already works, do more of it more often, rather than some of these rote, memorization type things that we've just been forced to do by the system for a long time. So, John, where can people learn? They're like, they listen to this podcast, they got to this point, they're like, I need more of John in my life. Where can they reach out and find you?
So they can find me at, I blog every week at Inside Higher Ed. It's called Just Visiting. So they can just Google Just Visiting Inside Higher Ed. I've got 11, 12 years worth of stuff on there if they want to dig into the archives. I keep a Substack newsletter called The Biblioracle Recommends. That's mostly about books and reading. That's one of my other passions and something I write about often. But I lately have been dipping into how these things overlap with education, because I can never not talk about that. That's The Biblioracle Recommends, biblioracle.substack.com. You can find me on Twitter at Biblioracle. I'm there far too often. And I'm very responsive there. I've already booked some one-on-one conferences with some people who are struggling immediately with how they assign writing. I'm like, hey, just reach out, let me know. I'm happy to jump on a Zoom and, we'll do a little quick inoculation, and then we'll talk about ways to cure the problem in a more lasting way. So yeah, look me up. I love to talk to people about this stuff. It's why I get up in the morning.
That is great. I will link to all of these in the show notes. If you're listening or watching, we'll link in the video or the podcast info below as well, so you can reach John. John, thanks again for coming on the Backwards Podcast. We appreciate it.
It was so much fun. Anytime.
Awesome. Thank you.